why am I against diversity? Because what diversity means is somebody who has the critical consciousness, the awakened consciousness of the way that the structural forces of society, whether it's systemic racism or whatever that they believe structures society, that those systemic forces have created a unique set of character. They call it the unique voice of color, as a matter of fact. And so diversity means that you are awakened to saying what, say, critical race theory says you're supposed to say about being whatever race you are. So if you're white, that means there's no positive white identity. If you're black, that means that you're politically black, as Nicole Hannah-Jones had it. Or if you want, like Ayanna Pressley said, we don't want any more black and brown faces who don't want to be black and brown voices. What's she talking about? She's talking about that you are somebody who speaks the politics that's supposed to be for that identity, and supposed to be is defined by being a critical race theorist, because they believe that everything is structurally determined. And so what does that make a diversity person? Well, in Ibram Kendi's exact words, a formally trained expert on racism. In other words, a critical race theorist. In other words, in older language, a commissar. And
because his definition of racism is not prejudice against someone because of their skin color. It is any policy. I think, how did he define racism? That one time he was like racism is racism and a racist racist.
Right. That's right. It's racism is racism when it's racist by a racist. That's really what it comes down to. He said that it was when you have racist outcomes determined by racist policy put in place by racist people.
Well, only by white people. He doesn't believe that a black or brown person can be racist,
No, I don't know, because Larry Elder ran for governor, and the LA Times said that he was the black face of white supremacy.
Yeah.
And then Dave Chappelle made jokes about trans people on his special, and they said that he used his white privilege to make those jokes.
But that actually goes exactly to the point that you are making, that those people, I think that they would say that, I think that they would say those two things at the same time. I think that Ibram X. Kendi would say a black or brown person, maybe, he would say, can't actually be racist because racism is prejudice plus power and only white people have power. You know that whole thing. But at the same time, they would say that someone like Larry Elder isn't actually black. So because Larry Elder isn't actually black, he's actually white. He's functionally white.
Yeah, because
he
he's structurally
can be
white.
Racist.
Yeah.
And so it sounds crazy, but decoding what they're saying, it does kind of make sense in some kind of convoluted way.
Since you brought up the prejudice plus power definition, by the way, that also was Patricia Bidall, the woman who was funded by the NEA in 1970. She came up with that.
And the ADL, is it the ADL that just came out with a new definition of racism, the Anti-Defamation League?
Yeah.
It was prejudice against someone because of his skin color. Now it is like a system of oppression against people of color only by white people.
Yeah, exactly. If you actually look up the definition of race used by critical race theory, it says that it's, a characterization created by white people originally from Europe that holds themselves up as the archetype of humanity, so that the white race, so that they can oppress other people. That's their definition of race. It's all like that. They have all these self-serving definitions that you don't know are happening. I say it all the time on Twitter. Communists share your vocabulary, but they don't share your dictionary.
Yeah.
They have completely different meanings. So back to your other question, though, why does it matter if corporations see the George Floyd incident and want to do that? It doesn't. What's weird is when all of them are doing it all at the same time with almost like copy pasta boilerplate, and then every university is saying the same thing and the government is saying the same thing. It is nothing natural is happening when myriad people across all kinds of walks of life are all saying and doing exactly the same thing. And this kind of weird, like if we took some of that boilerplate and read it in a chant, everybody would recognize this is a cult. This is really weird. But when you read it as it is, you realize this doesn't say anything really, except there are these key words now: commit to equity, yada, 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 which by the way also means socialism.
Yeah.
And so what's weird is that there was no diversity whatsoever in the response to this. There was no critical thought allowed. And if anybody attempted to, it either got drowned off media, or you got bullied, or people got screamed at, fists in their face, screaming at. There's that iconic image of the young woman who supported Black Lives Matter, by the way, sitting at a table. But she was like, I just don't want to raise my fist because you're making me. And they freaked out on her. This was what you said. What does it look like when they pounce? They pounced. everything had to be that from every direction, everywhere, all at once. And that was sustained for as long as they could sustain it.
And it was totally justified and defended, even by people that I know and respect. They, at the very least, so after the George Floyd thing happened, lots of, I'm very in, Christian white woman Instagram world. I see it. I see how they react to things. And even the ones who would say, they would definitely say, because I don't think that they are, they would say, I'm not a Marxist. Are you kidding me? I don't believe in Marxism. I don't believe in communism. I'm conservative like you. But they'll post the black square. They'll talk about anti-racism. They'll repost a story about Border Patrol agents whipping migrants. They'll always go with the left-wing narrative of something, especially when it comes to race, because they have white guilt themselves, but they'll say they're conservative. They'll say they're conservative evangelical and they're not progressive Christians and whatever, but they will never post the other side of the story while still just, defending themselves as completely apolitical and completely neutral. But they would call someone like me on the conservative side. They would never repost me or like one of my posts or agree with something I say. But they would be much quicker to defend an outright communist, I think, and a racial Marxist on their views, even though they consider themselves conservative. It's just wild to watch.
That's the two things there. That's the demoralization. People don't know how to feel like a good person in that bullying campaign that comes along with it. And so they go along with it because they kind of think maybe there's something to that, and they haven't really thought about it a lot. And then they're just going to kind of go with it because the bullying campaign is obvious and everybody else is doing it.
And there's some truth to it. Race. There are racists there. There's people who are racist, and they have friends who said, well, I've been followed around in a store, whatever. And so because of that empathy, which I would love to hear you talk about empathy, that's really the thing. Because of empathy, they have to post the black square. They have to say that they're reading Ibram X. Kendi.
Right. The funny thing is there was actually nothing racist whatsoever, as far as I can tell, about the George Floyd incident. There was, except that the cop was white and the victim was black.
And that's all you need in their formula.
Yeah, exactly. And so, who's projecting racism into the situation? It becomes a question at that point. But yeah, the weaponized empathy, lack of understanding what words mean because they've been made ambiguous. They mean multiple things at multiple times, depending on, who's using them and for what purposes. But with empathy, a lot of people get their heart out in front of their head. We need a heart. We need to have that care. But, everybody could think of kind of an example of somebody who just kind of, comical kind of television sort of scene where somebody's trying to help and they're flailing around trying to help and they're doing all the wrong things because all they want to do is help, but they don't actually know how to help, or they haven't taken time to slow down and assess the situation and do something that's appropriate for the situation. So there's this kind of, very emotionally driven empathy. And then which is very instinctual and it happens very fast and you feel like, something must be done. I have to care, and it's so important, or maybe I just do care. But then there's kind of head-driven empathy, which is kind of goal-driven or results-oriented empathy. Like something maybe is wrong. I don't know. Maybe something is wrong in the country with policing. I am suspicious. This has been a hard-driven narrative by Marxist organizations for a while, so I'm suspicious of the facts, but we should take a look and we should start saying, well, if there is this kind of pervasive problem, what does it actually look like? What do the data say? What are real solutions? How do we kind of A/B test potential solutions and see what the outcomes are and start picking solutions that work to whatever problem may actually be? How do you start to bridge the gap of lack of trust between these kind of inner city, predominantly black communities or neighborhoods and the police who feel like they have to police them in particular ways, particularly harder? And maybe is there racism there, and what can be done to bridge that trust? These are things that, kind of goal-oriented, thoughtful empathy. Like, I care about this issue and I want it resolved. Not, I care about this issue and somebody said this is the thing to do, so I have to do this.
Okay, another break to tell you guys about Patriot Mobile. This sponsor is awesome. They sponsor all kinds of conservative events and conservative podcasts, and we really love this advertiser because they don't just talk the talk, they walk the walk. This is a Christian conservative cell phone provider, America's only one. So when you use them as your provider, you can feel really good about where your money is going. These big cell phone providers, very often they take our money, they turn around and they give it to organizations that we don't believe in, that are espousing values that we don't believe in. And that is not the case with Patriot Mobile. You can trust that your money is going to a company that is supporting the values and the organizations that you believe in. They have plans to fit any budget, and their 100% US-based customer support team provides exceptional customer support. More importantly, Patriot Mobile shares your values and supports organizations fighting for religious freedom, constitutional rights, sanctity of life, and our veteran and first responder heroes. Go to patriotmobile.com/Allie. You can get free activation with the offer code Allie. First responders and veterans save even more. So make the switch today. That's patriotmobile.com/Allie or call 972-PATRIOT, patriotmobile.com/Allie. Yeah, and it reminds me of something that, and we actually haven't talked about critical race theory in a little bit. We kind of took a little bit of a break because we were talking about it so much, but something that we say a lot is by Thomas Sowell that disparities in themselves are not proof of discrimination.
Right.
And I think that's where this empathy piece comes in for people, that you see these gaps. This is what people on the left do, by the way. It's a little bit of a rhetorical trick. They say, well, why are Black people, being shot by the police at a higher rate than white people? Or why are they less likely to graduate from high school? Why are they on average poorer than white, or they probably won't even mention Asian. They'll just say than white Americans. And so you look at all of these gaps, and then someone fills in those gaps by saying, well, those gaps can only be because of discrimination.
Right.
And if you're on the other side of that, especially if you're a white person, you don't want to argue with a Black person who says that those gaps, those disparities are because of discrimination, especially when they say they do this trick too. And this has happened to me. Because I've said, well, disparities aren't proof of discrimination. There could be so many other factors that are playing in there. They'll say, oh, so it's our fault. So you're saying it's some innate characteristic that's causing these disparities. And actually, Thomas Sowell debunked that back in the 1980s. And so it's a conversation that's been going on for a long time. But you could see how your average person, especially your average white person who wants to be empathetic, when you hear from a Black person, well, these are the reasons for the disparities, you don't want to argue against that and say, well, what does the data say? Is that really true that it's because of discrimination? Then you really seem like a bigot and a racist, and no one wants to be that.
Well, you seem like you're uncaring. And then that gets transformed into bigotry and racism. These manipulations are extremely subtle. Like, a lot of the people that are doing the manipulations don't even necessarily know that they're engaging in what boils down to a moral extortion racket, which is what that's
such a good way to put it.
That was a moral extortion racket being put on you. You say there's a problem. You think, you've offered there. So we'll take for granted that the problem is real and exists. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it doesn't, but let's take for granted that it does. And then you've offered an interpretation of that problem, and you don't have to actually deny the problem to deny the interpretation.
Exactly.
And so we're often wrong. Our interpretations of what's going on are frequently wrong. Every time anybody's ever got food poisoning, they're like, oh, I must have ate some bad chicken or whatever. And chances were it was a salad bar. That's a classically known thing because it's not cooked.
Right.
And so, we don't really know. Our interpretations are not always that great. And so we should be questioning each other's interpretations, and data are the best way to resolve those questions. But these manipulations are extremely subtle. And by the way, Ibram Kendi has called directly for reversing that mentality. In 2019, he wrote an essay, or a paragraph really, for Politico. How do you fix inequality? And he says that we should have an anti-racist constitutional amendment. And the second of the two principles that he says that should be in that constitutional amendment is that inequity, or differences in outcomes, shall be taken as proof of discrimination.
Right.
So that's the only possible explanation. Now, you can see that this is going to be a disaster in the making if that's what you're actually going to do, is always boil it down to, the explanation for whatever happened in advance. And then it's something very sensitive like racism that you can inflame people and you can get people, I don't want to be associated with racism, so I'm not going to argue. It's a very subtle and nasty manipulation